December 16, 1944, the Ardennes forest, Belgium, before dawn. Picture this, a convoy of American jeeps rolling through the fog-choked roads of eastern Belgium, their tires crunching over fresh snow. Inside these vehicles sit what appear to be American GI's helmets tilted at that casual angle, cigarettes dangling from lips, speaking what sounds like English with Midwestern accents. They wave casually at checkpoints. They flash the right signals. They know the passwords. But something is wrong. Something is terribly, viscerally wrong. Because these men aren't Americans at all. They're German commandos, hand-picked killers wearing stolen uniforms, speaking rehearsed English, driving captured vehicles deep into Allied lines with orders to spread chaos, cut communications, and assassinate senior commanders. They are living lies wrapped in enemy cloth, and if they're caught, the Geneva Convention offers them nothing. They'll be shot as spies. This is Operation Greif, Operation Griffin I, of the most audacious, bizarre, and ultimately doomed covert operations of World War II. It was the brainchild of Otto Skorzeny, Hitler's favorite commando, a 6'4" Austrian with a dueling scar slashed across his face, who looked like he'd been carved from granite by a mad sculptor. And it was launched as part of Hitler's last great gamble in the West, the Battle of the Bulge, Germany's final desperate attempt to split the Allied armies, recapture the port of Antwerp, and turn the tide of a war that was already. This is Operation Greif, Operation Griffin I, of the most audacious, bizarre, and ultimately doomed covert operations of World War II. It was the brainchild of Otto Skorzeny, Hitler's favorite commando, a 6'4" Austrian with a dueling scar slashed across his face, who looked like he'd been carved from granite by a mad sculptor. And it was launched as part of Hitler's last great gamble in the West, the Battle of the Bulge, Germany's final desperate attempt to split the Allied armies, recapture the port of Antwerp, and turn the tide of a war that was already slipping through their fingers like blood-soaked snow. But why does this story matter? Why should we care about a failed German operation that history has largely relegated to footnotes and curiosity pieces? Because Operation Greif reveals something profound about the psychology of warfare, about desperation and improvisation, about how fear can be weaponized more effectively than bullets, and about how a handful of men in the wrong uniforms nearly paralyzed an entire army. This is a story about identity and deception, about the thin line between soldier and spy, and about what happens when war stops being about front lines and becomes about trust itself. So let's go back to the autumn of 1944 when Germany was dying, and Adolf Hitler decided to play one last lethal card. By the fall of 1944, Nazi Germany was a wounded animal backed into a corner, and wounded animals are dangerous precisely because they have nothing left to lose. The Allies had landed in Normandy on June 6th, smashed through the hedgerows of France, liberated Paris in August, and were now pushing toward the German border. In the east, the Soviet Red Army was grinding westward like a mechanized avalanche, swallowing territory at a horrific cost in blood and steel. Germany was being crushed between two industrial juggernauts, and everyone knew it. Everyone, perhaps, except Adolf Hitler. Hitler's response to this existential crisis wasn't acceptance or negotiation. It was one final apocalyptic counteroffensive. He envisioned a massive surprise attack through the Ardennes forest, the same route German panzers had used to devastating effect in 1940. The plan was audacious to the point of fantasy. Punch through the weakly defended American lines, race to the Meuse River, capture the vital port of Antwerp, and split the British and American armies. If successful, Hitler believed, it would force the Western Allies to negotiate a separate peace, allowing Germany to concentrate all its remaining strength against the Soviets. It was a gambler's logic, the reasoning of a man who'd started the war with spectacular blitzes and couldn't conceive of ending it any other way. The operation was codenamed Wacht am Rhein Watch, on the Rhine a deliberate piece of misdirection, suggesting a defensive posture. In reality, Hitler was scraping together every available panzer, every drop of fuel, every soldier who could hold a rifle for one last roll of the dice. But conventional military force alone wouldn't be enough. Hitler wanted something more, something that would amplify the shock and confusion of the attack. He wanted psychological warfare. He wanted terror behind enemy lines. He wanted the Americans to doubt everything they saw, everyone they met, every uniform that approached them in the chaos of battle. Enter Otto Skorzeny. If central casting had wanted a Nazi commando for a Hollywood film, they would have created Skorzeny. Born in Vienna in 1908, Skorzeny was a trained engineer who joined the Austrian Nazi Party and later the Waffen-SS. He stood 6 feet 4 inches tall, weighed over 200 pounds, and bore a distinctive scar running from his left ear to his chin, a souvenir from a university fencing duel. He looked like a villain from a pulp adventure novel, and he played the part perfectly. Skorzeny had already made his name in September 1943 when he led the daring rescue of Mussolini from a mountaintop hotel in Italy, snatching the deposed fascist dictator, literally, from under Allied noses using gliders and audacity. Hitler called him the most dangerous man in Europe, and Skorzeny wore that title like a medal. In mid-October 1944, Skorzeny was summoned to the Wolf's Lair, Hitler's Eastern Front headquarters in East Prussia. He arrived expecting another special operations assignment, perhaps another rescue or assassination. Instead, Hitler presented him with something far stranger. The Führer wanted Skorzeny to form a special brigade of English-speaking German soldiers who would disguise themselves as Americans, infiltrate behind enemy lines during the coming offensive, and create maximum chaos. They would cut telephone lines, change road signs, misdirect traffic, spread false rumors, and if possible, assassinate senior Allied commanders. It was espionage on a grand scale, spycraft weaponized as a force multiplier for a conventional military operation. Skorzeny was stunned. He understood immediately the enormous challenges and the even greater risks. Finding enough German soldiers who spoke fluent, colloquial American English would be nearly impossible. Acquiring authentic American uniforms, vehicles, and equipment would require miracles of logistics. And if any of his men were captured, they'd face immediate execution as spies. The operation violated the laws of war, and everyone involved knew it. But Skorzeny also knew better than to argue with Hitler in the autumn of 1944. The Führer was increasingly detached from reality, prone to rages, clinging to fantasies of wonder weapons and final victories. So Skorzeny saluted, accepted the mission, and began the impossible task of building his phantom army. The recruitment drive for Operation Greif began immediately, and it was as chaotic as it was desperate. Skorzeny needed men who could pass as Americans, which meant not just speaking English, but speaking it with the right accent, the right slang, the right casual attitude. Notices went out across the Wehrmacht and SS. Any soldier with English language skills was to report immediately. What arrived was a motley collection of men with wildly varying abilities. Some had lived in America before the war, working as waiters or mechanics, and spoke English fluently. Others had learned British English from textbooks and sounded like Victorian schoolmasters trying to order a hamburger. Some claimed to speak English but could barely manage "good morning." The variation was absurd, almost comical, except that the stakes were deadly serious. In the end, Skorzeny managed to assemble about 150 men who had reasonable English skills. Though only about 10 could truly pass as native speakers, the rest would have to keep their mouths shut and hope for the best. They were formed into Panzer Brigade 150, though calling it a proper brigade was generous. It was more like an improvised theatre company preparing for the deadliest performance of their lives. The men were given crash courses in American culture, slang, and military procedures. They studied American movies, listened to American radio broadcasts, and memorized details about baseball teams, Hollywood stars, and state capitals. They practiced walking like Americans, which apparently meant a looser, more relaxed gait than the rigid German military bearing. They learned to smoke their cigarettes differently, to salute more casually, to curse in English. It was method acting for soldiers, and the penalty for a bad performance was a bullet. Gathering authentic American equipment was another nightmare. Skorzeny needed jeeps, trucks, tanks, uniforms, weapons, dog tags, cigarettes, chocolate bars, everything that would make his men look and feel like legitimate GIs. Some equipment was captured from previous battles. Some was stolen from prisoner of war camps. Some was manufactured in Germany. Crude forgeries that wouldn't survive close inspection, but might work at a distance or in confusion. The crown jewel of this collection was supposed to be captured American Sherman tanks, which would be used to spread chaos at critical road junctions. But Shermans were in short supply, so German mechanics were ordered to disguise German Panther tanks to look like Sherman's a cosmetic surgery job involving metal plates and paint that fooled absolutely no one who looked carefully but might work in smoke and panic. The entire operation was built on desperation and improvisation, held together by wishful thinking and the grim determination of men who knew they were probably going to die. Skorzeny himself was under no illusions. He understood that Operation Greif was a sideshow, a psychological gambit meant to amplify the main offensive. If the Ardennes attack succeeded, his commandos might sow enough confusion to accelerate the collapse. If it failed, well, they'd all be dead or captured anyway. But orders were orders, and in Hitler's Germany in 1944, you followed orders or you faced the consequences. So Skorzeny trained his men, assembled his equipment, and waited for the weather to turn, because the entire operation depended on one final element that no amount of planning could control: fog, snow, and winter storms that would ground Allied aircraft and give the German offensive a fighting chance. December arrived cold and bitter across the Ardennes. The region was a heavily forested, hilly stretch of Belgium and Luxembourg that most Allied commanders considered unsuitable for major offensive operations. The roads were narrow and winding, the villages small and scattered, the terrain more obstacle than opportunity, which was precisely why the Americans had thinly garrisoned it, using the Ardennes as a quiet sector where green troops could gain experience and exhausted veterans could rest. Along an 80-mile front, only 4 American divisions held the line, spread dangerously thin. They sat in foxholes and farmhouses, playing cards, writing letters home, convinced that the war was winding down and that the real fighting was happening elsewhere. They were catastrophically, tragically wrong. On the German side of the line, an entire army was coiling like a spring. 3 full armies, the 6th SS Panzer Army in the north, the 5th Panzer Army in the center, the 7th Army in the south, were being positioned in absolute secrecy. Hitler had ordered total radio silence. Troops moved at night. Tanks were camouflaged under trees. Artillery was hidden in barns and forests. Everything was designed to achieve total surprise, because surprise was the only advantage Germany still possessed. Fuel was so scarce that many German units were counting on capturing American fuel depots to keep their advance going. Ammunition was rationed. Air cover was non-existent because the Luftwaffe had been bled white over the skies of Germany. But Hitler believed, with the fervor of a desperate gambler, that shock and aggression could overcome material disadvantage. Skorzeny's commandos were inserted into this massive offensive as a special spearhead. The plan called for them to infiltrate American lines during the first hours of the attack, when confusion would be at its maximum. They would be organized into small teams, some in jeeps, some on foot tasked with specific objectives. Some teams would change road signs to misdirect American reinforcements. Others would cut telephone wires to disrupt communications. A few elite teams, the ones with the best English speakers, would attempt the most dangerous missions, impersonating American military police, setting up false checkpoints, and spreading rumors designed to create panic. There was even wild talk of assassinating General Dwight Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, though this was more fantasy than operational planning. The commandos were issued their disguises, American uniforms stripped from prisoners and corpses, dog tags taken from the dead, packs of Lucky Strike cigarettes, Hershey chocolate bars, chewing gum, all the small totems of American military life. They were given forged identification papers and memorized cover stories. Each man carried cyanide capsules, though it's unclear how many intended to use them. The psychological weight on these soldiers was enormous. They weren't just going into battle. They were going into a performance where every word, every gesture, every moment could betray them. And betrayal meant capture, interrogation, and execution by firing squad. As December 16th approached, the weather cooperated with Teutonic efficiency. Heavy fog rolled across the Ardennes, thick as wool, reducing visibility to a few dozen yards. Snow fell intermittently, covering the ground in a white shroud that muffled sound and disoriented navigation. Allied reconnaissance aircraft were grounded. American radar couldn't penetrate the murk. The Germans had their window, and they were going to use it. On the night of December 15th, Skorzeny briefed his men one final time. He reminded them of their mission, of the importance of maintaining their disguises, of the need to spread confusion rather than engage in prolonged firefights. He wished them luck, though he knew luck was a commodity in desperately short supply. Then they moved out into the freezing darkness, heading toward the American lines, each man wondering if he would live to see another sunrise. At 0530 hours on December 16th, 1944, the German artillery opened fire. 2,000 guns erupted simultaneously along the 80-mile front. turning the pre-dawn darkness into a landscape of fire and thunder. American soldiers, many of them asleep in their dugouts and farmhouses, were shocked awake by the most intense barrage they'd ever experienced. Shells screamed overhead, exploding in forests and villages, tearing apart buildings and bodies with equal indifference. The ground shook, trees splintered. The fog lit up with orange and red flashes, creating a hellish, surreal atmosphere where sound and light became weapons in themselves. This was the opening move of the Battle of the Bulge, and it caught the Americans almost completely by surprise. In the chaos of that first morning, Skorzeny's commandos began their infiltration. Small teams of German soldiers, dressed in American uniforms and driving captured jeeps, pushed through the shattered American lines. Some teams managed to slip through gaps blown open by the artillery. Others talked their way past confused checkpoints, waving and shouting greetings in English, relying on the universal chaos to avoid close scrutiny. The key was confidence and timing. In the first hours of a massive offensive, everything is confusion. Units are scattered. Communications are disrupted. Nobody knows exactly where the front line is or who's in charge. In that fog of war, a jeep full of men in American uniforms, driving with apparent purpose, could go almost anywhere. One team, led by an Oberleutnant who'd worked as a mechanic in Chicago before the war, successfully cut telephone lines along a major supply route, isolating an American division headquarters for several critical hours. Another team changed road signs at a key intersection, sending an American artillery battalion driving in circles for half a day when they were desperately needed at the front. These were small victories, tactical pinpricks, but they multiplied the chaos. American commanders began receiving contradictory reports. Units couldn't find the positions they were ordered to defend. Reinforcements arrived hours late or not at all. The Germans were exploiting fog, surprise, and confusion like a three-pronged attack, and for the first day or two it worked terrifyingly well. But the Operation Greif teams soon encountered a problem that no amount of training could overcome. The Americans started catching them. The first break came early. An American patrol stopped a jeep carrying 4 men in US uniforms who seemed nervous and evasive. Under questioning, their English fell apart. They were searched, and beneath their American jackets, the patrol found German uniforms and papers. They were immediately identified as spies and taken to the rear for interrogation. Within hours, word spread through the American command. There were German commandos disguised as Americans operating behind the lines. The reaction was swift and overwhelming. Paranoia swept through the American forces like wildfire. Suddenly, every soldier was suspicious of every other soldier. Checkpoints multiplied. Passwords changed hourly, and Allied troops began administering impromptu pop quizzes on American culture to anyone who looked even slightly out of place. The questions were brilliantly, absurdly effective. American soldiers would stop vehicles and demand to know who won the World Series, or who Mickey Mouse's girlfriend was, or what the capital of Illinois was, or how many home runs Babe Ruth hit. These weren't military questions. They were cultural shibboleths, things that any American would know but that no German, no matter how well trained, could reliably answer. Skorzeny's commandos, for all their preparation, hadn't memorized batting averages or cartoon characters. They stumbled over questions about state capitals. They confused baseball with American football. They didn't know that Springfield, not Chicago, was the capital of Illinois. These tiny gaps in cultural knowledge became death sentences. Over the next few days, American troops captured more than a dozen Operation Greif commandos. Each capture fed the paranoia. Rumors spread wildly, growing more elaborate with each retelling. It was said that the Germans had infiltrated hundreds, maybe thousands of English-speaking soldiers behind Allied lines. It was whispered that assassination squads were hunting for Eisenhower and other senior commanders. One particularly persistent rumor claimed that Skorzeny himself was leading a team to Paris to kill Ike personally. None of this was true. But truth is often the first casualty of war, and paranoia spreads faster than accurate information. General Eisenhower was placed under virtual house arrest in Versailles, surrounded by guards who checked the identity of everyone who approached him. Senior officers were stopped at checkpoints and interrogated. General Omar Bradley, commanding the U.S. 12th Army Group, was detained at a checkpoint because he correctly identified Springfield as the capital of Illinois, but was overruled by a guard who was certain it was Chicago. Even high-ranking American officers weren't immune to the madness. For Skorzeny's men still operating, the situation became impossible. The element of surprise was gone. The Americans were now hyper-alert, stopping everything that moved, questioning everyone. The commandos were forced to abandon their disguises and either try to fight their way back to German lines or go to ground and hope to survive. Some succeeded, most didn't. The ones who were captured faced military tribunals. The verdict was never in doubt. Under the laws of war, soldiers who disguise themselves in enemy uniforms and operate behind enemy lines are classified as spies, not prisoners of war. The Geneva Convention offered them no protection. Between December and January, 18 captured Operation Greif commandos were tried, convicted, and executed by firing squad. They died in the snow outside Belgian farmhouses, blindfolded, hands bound, shot by soldiers who might have respected them as enemies but could show no mercy to spies. The psychological impact of Operation Greif, however, far exceeded its tactical results. While the actual commandos were being hunted down and shot, the fear they inspired continued to paralyze the American rear areas for days. Troops wasted time and energy on security measures that, while understandable, slowed the Allied response to the German offensive. Convoys were delayed, communications were disrupted. Senior commanders were isolated from their units. In a perverse way, Operation Greif succeeded not through its execution, but through its existence. The mere knowledge that German commandos were operating behind the lines created a crisis of trust that amplified the chaos of the Bulge far more effectively than the small teams of infiltrators ever could have achieved on their own. By Christmas Day 1944, the Battle of the Bulge was still raging, but the German offensive had lost its momentum. American reinforcements were pouring into the Ardennes. The weather was clearing, allowing Allied aircraft to attack German supply lines. The panzers were running out of fuel, the infantry was exhausted, and the surprise was gone. What had started as Hitler's last great gamble was turning into a catastrophic bloodbath that Germany could not afford. The Bulge, the salient the Germans had punched into Allied lines, was being compressed from all sides. By the end of January, the battle would be over, and Germany would have lost over 100,000 casualties it could never replace, along with hundreds of tanks and thousands of vehicles it could never rebuild. The Ardennes offensive didn't split the Allied armies or force a negotiated peace. Instead, it accelerated Germany's collapse by burning through the last reserves of men and materiel Hitler could scrape together. Operation Greif died with the offensive. Of the roughly 150 commandos Skorzeny had assembled, fewer than half returned to German lines. The rest were killed in action, captured, or simply disappeared into the chaos of the battle. The 18 men who were executed as spies became martyrs in German propaganda, proof of Allied barbarity, though the legal grounds for their execution were unassailable under international law. Otto Skorzeny himself survived the war. He was captured by American forces in May 1945 and tried for war crimes, specifically for ordering his men to wear enemy uniforms. In a bizarre twist of military justice, Skorzeny was acquitted after British commandos testified that Allied forces had used similar deception tactics in their own operations. Skorzeny later escaped from a prison camp, fled to Spain, and spent the rest of his life as a shadowy figure in the post-war world, allegedly working as a security consultant and arms dealer. He died in Madrid in 1975, never expressing regret for Operation Greif or any of his wartime actions. For the Americans, Operation Greif left a complicated legacy. On one level, it was a failure, a small-scale operation that achieved minimal tactical results and was quickly suppressed. But on another level, it revealed a vulnerability in modern warfare that remains relevant today. Skorzeny had demonstrated that identity and trust could be weaponized, that a handful of infiltrators could create disproportionate chaos by simply wearing the wrong uniform and speaking the wrong language. The operation forced the US military to develop better security protocols, more sophisticated identification systems, and a deeper understanding of psychological warfare. The pop quizzes on American culture became legendary, part of the folklore of World War II, remembered in memoirs and histories as a moment when baseball knowledge became a matter of life and death. The emotional cost was harder to quantify. For the American soldiers who served in the Bulge, Operation Greif added a layer of psychological horror to an already nightmarish battle. It wasn't just that the Germans were attacking with overwhelming force through terrible weather in terrible terrain. It was that you couldn't trust what you saw. That man in an American uniform might be trying to kill you. That jeep with US markings might be full of saboteurs. That order you just received might have come from a German commando impersonating an officer. War is already a realm of uncertainty and fear, but Operation Greif turned uncertainty into paranoia, and paranoia is exhausting. It corrodes morale. It makes every decision fraught with second-guessing. The Battle of the Bulge was the bloodiest battle American forces fought in Europe, with over 19,000 American dead and many more wounded or captured. Operation Greif didn't cause all that suffering, but it added to it, a psychological wound layered on top of physical trauma. So why has Operation Greif been largely forgotten, relegated to the margins of World War II history? Perhaps because it doesn't fit our preferred narratives about the war. We like our history to be clear-cut, with identifiable heroes and villains, decisive battles and clean victories. Operation Greif was messy, morally ambiguous, and ultimately inconsequential to the war's outcome. It didn't stop the Allies, it didn't save Germany, and it didn't change the course of history. It was a sideshow, a footnote, the kind of operation that historians mention briefly and then move on from. But I'd argue that Operation Greif deserves more attention precisely because it's complicated and uncomfortable. It forces us to confront questions about the laws of war, about the difference between soldiers and spies, about what tactics are legitimate, and what crosses the line into treachery. Skorzeny's commandos were soldiers following orders, but they were also spies engaged in deception, and they paid the price when they were caught. Were the Americans right to execute them? By the letter of international law, absolutely. But war creates situations where legal correctness and moral clarity don't always align, and Operation Greif exists in that grey zone. The operation also reveals something profound about leadership and desperation. Hitler's decision to launch the Ardennes offensive, including Operation Greif, was the act of a man who refused to accept defeat, who chose to gamble everything on one last roll of the dice, rather than negotiate or surrender. It was the logic of the fanatic, the gambler, the ideologue who believes that willpower can overcome material reality. And it failed, spectacularly, at a cost of hundreds of thousands of lives. Skorzeny, for his part, was a soldier who followed orders even when those orders were probably suicidal and certainly violated the norms of warfare. He was brave, resourceful, and charismatic, and he used those qualities in service of one of history's most evil regimes. There's no simple moral to that story, no easy lesson except perhaps that competence and courage are not the same as wisdom or virtue. What Operation Greif ultimately demonstrates is that war is not just about firepower and logistics. It's about psychology, about perception, about the stories we tell ourselves and each other. Skorzeny understood this. He knew that a few dozen men in stolen uniforms couldn't defeat the Allied armies, but they could make those armies doubt themselves, slow themselves down, waste time and energy on shadows and paranoia. Fear, properly leveraged, is a force multiplier. Deception, skillfully executed, can achieve results far beyond its material investment. These lessons weren't new in 1944, and they haven't become outdated in the decades since. If anything, in an age of information warfare, deep fakes, and online disinformation, Operation Greif feels strangely contemporary. A reminder that the battlefield isn't just physical terrain, but also the human mind. In the end, the commandos of Operation Greif were pawns in a larger game, sacrificed in Hitler's last desperate bid to stave off the inevitable. They dressed in enemy uniforms, spoke borrowed words, drove stolen vehicles into enemy territory, and most of them died for it. Some were shot as spies, some were killed in combat, a few made it home, carrying memories they probably never spoke about. Their operation didn't change the war, but for a few days in December 1944, in the frozen forests of the Ardennes, they turned warfare into theatre, soldiers into actors, and identity itself into a weapon. And perhaps that's the real legacy of Operation Greif, not what it accomplished, but what it revealed about the nature of modern war, about how thin the line is between soldier and spy, between uniform and disguise, between the face we show the world and the face we hide. In war, as in life, nothing is ever quite what it seems, and trust is always the first casualty. Otto Skorzeny once said, "In war, the important thing is not to be right, but to win." He was wrong about that, as history ultimately proved. But Operation Greif remains a testament to what happens when desperate men try to win by any means necessary, and to the high price paid by those who fight wars in borrowed skin.